Okay, well, welcome to your return to this class. We kind of left off at an interesting part in the class where we're transitioning into thinking about different types of markets. So we're kind of just disrupted right in the middle of some connected content. If you recall, what we were talking about before the last exam is we were discussing perfect competition. So some of the key ideas in perfect competition, let's first think about some of those assumptions that we had. You have homogeneous products, where all products are the same. So everybody's selling the same type of product, like soy or oil or something like that could potentially be perfect competition. Many buyers and sellers. So again, soy being a good example. Here you can see for some goods, they're going to fit into some of these assumptions, but not others. So oil, homogeneous product, it's all really the same, but there's not many buyers and sellers. There's only a select amount of sellers, and some sellers have more power than others. Free entry and exit. So anybody that wants to sell the good can sell the good, and anybody who wants to stop selling the good can stop. And then finally, perfect information. So if all of these criteria are met, then you have perfect competition. Okay, in the case of perfect competition, all of these four assumptions will lead to the key result. Ultimately, that firms are price takers, meaning that they have to accept whatever price that there is in the market. So for example, if you want to sell soy, you can't just choose whatever price you want. You have to sell based on the market price. We showed this in our graphs. If you recall, we had the graph of the market, which corresponded to the graph for the individual firm, where they face a perfectly elastic demand curve. And so what this means basically is that firms only choose quantity. If there's two main things that firms have the potential to choose, price and quantity, in perfect competition, they have no control over the price, so quantity is the only thing they can choose. So all of that is review. That basically is all in the last exam. You're not really going to be tested on that again. But we need to think about this as we move towards the opposite end of the spectrum. So if you've got perfect competition on this side, and a complete extreme where firms have no control, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum would be monopolies. Monopolies exist when there's only one firm selling a good or service. So we need to think about some of the assumptions. So in the version of the book I'm using, this is chapter 24, Monopolies. It's the chapter immediately following perfect competition. And of course, probably don't have to define this, but just in case you don't know where the term comes from, a monopoly is a market with only one producer. A market with only one producer. So, for example, you could make the argument perhaps that at Georgia College, Sodexo does our food. So they have a monopoly of sorts. It's not a real strong monopoly because you can, walk downtown and get food elsewhere, but it's a type of monopoly. We sometimes call that a spatial monopoly. In the space of Georgia College, they're the only ones that can sell food. All right. So that's an example of monopoly. A more stringent example would be, power companies in most towns. Most places only have one electrical company, so they are a true monopoly. If you're going to live in that town, you really have no other option. So there are monopolies, true monopolies, extreme monopolies, like power companies. And then there's other firms that operate close to monopolies, like Sodexo at Georgia College. They have a monopoly of sorts, okay? So we're going to start off thinking about the most extreme cases where a company has a true monopoly. They are literally the only seller in a big area, okay? So some of the key assumptions here. So, we had those key assumptions for perfect competition. Now let's think about it for monopolies. Obviously, the first assumption is there's only one seller. And that can come about for many different reasons. We'll get into those reasons why this might happen. Second assumption is that the seller is selling products that have no close substitute. So they're selling something that you can't readily get a substitute for. So for example, electricity, right? If you don't have electricity, there's no easy way to power your house in this day and age. Maybe that'll change over time with solar power and such, but for now there's no easy way to do that, to change over, okay? This basically means that if you're selling something, people can't just switch to another good. So for example, Coca-Cola has, they have a trademark on Coca-Cola, okay? So you could say, well, they have a monopoly for Coke. And the problem is that Coke has many close substitutes like Pepsi, so it's not really a monopoly, okay? So there needs to be the scenario where there's only one seller and they're selling a product that is unique that you can't easily substitute away and get something else similar. And then the third assumption is that there are, at least usually, barriers to entry of some sort. So there's some reason why another firm can't come in and compete. This one's kind of debatable in a sense. If you go to a small town, for example, and they only have one gas station, that gas station is a monopoly of sorts, but it doesn't really hold with this assumption. And the logic there is that another gas station could open up if they wanted to, so it's kind of hard to decide if they're a true monopoly or not. If we're going to use the most stringent definition, technically they're not, because another firm could easily move into that market, right? They could freely enter the market. So these are the things you need to look for. When you're thinking about, is there a monopoly or why did a monopoly happen, think about these things here. So for example, if there's a firm that develops a cure for the coronavirus, right, for COVID-19, they would probably have a trademark or copyright on that drug, okay, some sort of patent. And as a result, they would be selling the good that has no close substitutes, okay? On the contrary, if some firm develops some sort of drug that, again, stops the coronavirus, but they don't get a trademark, well, then the second assumption won't be met, and you won't have a monopoly, okay? So in order for a monopoly to be met, you need these assumptions to happen, okay? So let's talk real quickly about those barriers. We're kind of thinking now, in a realistic sense, why do these things happen? So let me give you some reasons for some of these barriers. We just discussed some of these. You may have legal barriers, such as patents, copyrights, things of that nature. And a lot of times what these things do is they give you a certain amount of time to sell the good that you've created. So for patents, it's often 20 years, depending on the type of industry that we're discussing. And the logic of the patent is this. If I'm going to develop a medicine that's really useful and that a lot of people want, well, if I know that somebody else can just copy my design and create the medicine that I, invented, well, then that's going to disincentivize me. The whole reason why I might want to create a really good medicine, because I have to think about profits. I can't just live on no money. I've got to think about profits. So the whole reason I would create a medicine is for the profitability of it, okay? And what the patent does is it gives me perhaps a 20-year timeline where I can sell the good and no one else can sell it, all right? It gives me an incentive to create it because I know I've got 20 years where no one can compete with me. Now after that 20 years, the patent goes away and now the free market can jump in and everyone can produce it, but it gives an incentive to innovate. All right, it's a government-created incentive to innovate, which is interesting because in a lot of cases, monopolies are illegal, all right? But then in other cases, monopolies are actually caused by the government. So there's an interesting interplay here. We would like to incentivize new creation of products, but monopolies, as you'll see, typically are bad for consumers, right? If I create a medicine that stops the coronavirus and I'm going to charge everyone $100,000 for it, you can see why that might be a problem for consumers, right? Only the wealthy are going to be able to afford it. So you may have legal barriers. Another possibility is you may have economies of scale. This is the term that we went over before the second exam. Economies of scale occurs when the increase in production leads to a reduction in long run average total cost. So as you produce more and more and more, your average costs are getting driven down further and further. Basically, that means that every unit you produce is cheaper than the one before. And to get back to that example of an electrical company, this is a really good example. All right, if you've already got a dam like we have in Milledgeville that's providing power, and you've already got wires all over town supplying power, then adding just one more customer, very cheap. The very first customer that was given electrical power, that was very expensive for that firm to create. They had to build the dam, they had to run wires out to them. But after the wires are out and after the dam is created, adding new customers is very cheap. So as the production goes up, long run average total cost goes down. All right, it just looks like this. That's economies of scale. And if this occurs, you may end up with a natural monopoly, which again, we defined last testing cycle. And a natural monopoly means that naturally there will be a monopoly in a market like this, because if you're the biggest firm, no one can compete with you. If I'm the firm that's producing a very high quantity down here, well then how are you going to enter the market and produce at a low quantity? You can't, right? You can't come in and compete with me because I'll be able to beat you on prices every single time. So that's called a natural monopoly, and it's a result of economies of scale. So you may have legal barriers, you may have naturally occurring monopolies, and then the third possibility is access to a key resource. So you might have exclusive access to something that no one else has. So for example, some people have suggested that De Beers, you may have heard of De Beers, right? They're the ones that go in and they find diamonds and sell them. Some people have suggested they're basically a monopoly because they have access to so many of the mines. They've basically attained most of the mines in the United States. They have such a big share of the market that they operate close to being a monopoly, okay? So access to a key resource, Sodexo at Georgia College, right? That's kind of like combining these two. There's a legal barrier in the sense that the state government of Georgia has allowed Sodexo to be the exclusive seller, but also they have access to a key resource, which is Georgia College's campus, okay? So in some cases it may be caused by the government, but not always. An example with De Beers, right? De Beers has nothing to do with governments. They've just gone in and bought a bunch of the mines over time, and now they're able to charge a higher price for diamonds. So one of these three criteria is going to be met for monopolies to occur. I will just add one more kind of questionable one here, and that's just that you may have a small market, right? You may just be in an area that just doesn't have a lot of consumers, and thus there may only be one producer of an item. So that might be in a town like Greensboro, Georgia. They only have one brewery, so you can make the argument that they're a monopoly. In downtown Milledgeville, maybe Blackbird Coffee is really the only producer of decent coffee in downtown. So small markets may also cause this to happen. Okay, so erasing all that, I'm going to try to, as I teach this stuff, give you little clues about where we are if you're trying to follow along with the text. It's probably a good idea to try to read the chapters if you're doing this, because it's going to be hard to get a lot from just the lectures. And of course, do the practice problems and everything that I'm posting as well. So this is going to come now from 24-2. This is monopoly pricing and output decisions. And this is where we're going to start to see some of the math. And so this is where the challenge